Jake was speeding down the narrow street on his motorcycle, the roar of the engine drowning out everything around him. His mind was a blur of thoughts, mostly about the bills piling up, the quiet apartment he'd come home to the night before, and how empty everything felt. There was no one left in his life to fill the void. Not since the accident that had taken his wife. It was the kind of day where you didn't expect much, and when life didn't expect much from you either. Jake was just another guy on the road, passing through life like a shadow, quick and unnoticed. But today would be different. Today, everything would change. As he rounded a sharp corner, his eyes caught sight of something small and furry darting across the street. It was too late. He didn't have time to stop. The tires screeched for a moment, the motorcycle jolted under him, and he felt it. The sickening thud as the front tire made contact with something. He slammed the brakes and skidded to a halt, heart hammering in his chest. When he looked down, his stomach churned. A small gray tabby cat lay on its side, its fur matted with dirt and its eyes wide open, unblinking. "Shit," Jake muttered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He got off the bike and crouched down beside the motionless animal. The world around him seemed to freeze, but all he could focus on was the little creature at his feet. His fingers trembled as he reached for the cat's limp body, but before he could even think of what to do next, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, you okay?" Jake spun around, startled. Standing at the edge of the sidewalk was a man, tall, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses that covered most of his face. But there was something about him that was different, something almost familiar. "Yeah, I'm fine," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned back to the cat, trying to avoid the stranger's gaze. He didn't know what to do, how to fix what he'd just done. The guilt was overwhelming. "Are you sure?" the man asked, stepping closer. Jake barely noticed the way the guy's presence seemed to shift the air around him, making the world feel just a little bit more real. Just give me a second," Jake muttered, kneeling down beside the cat again. His mind was a mess, torn between trying to help the animal, trying to escape, and trying to figure out how to make everything right again. But the man was persistent. "Did you hit that cat?" the stranger asked, his voice calm but firm. There was no anger in it, just curiosity. Jake's eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Yeah," Jake replied flatly. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't stop in time." The stranger paused, then said something Jake didn't expect. "You know, you've got to be careful. Sometimes you can't just keep going, pretending things didn't happen." Jake looked up. The man was standing there, watching him with a sort of quiet intensity, as if waiting for him to respond. Jake opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. For a brief moment, the stranger's voice seemed to echo in Jake's head, like a warning. Just then, the cat twitched. Jake's heart stopped. The cat opened its eyes and let out a soft, weak mew. "Holy!" Jake cut himself off, kneeling down and gently lifting the cat into his hands. It was alive. Barely, but alive. "Look at that," the stranger said with a small smile, his tone oddly reassuring. "Seems like fate had other plans for that little guy." Jake didn't know what to say. He just cradled the cat in his arms, a small sense of relief washing over him, mixed with a deep, gnawing guilt. "You should get that cat to the vet," the stranger added. "Make sure it's okay." Jake nodded absently, still shaken by the whole incident. He turned to his bike, the weight of the situation pulling him in two directions, his instinct to leave and the desire to do something good for once. "Something right. I'll take care of it," Jake muttered. "Thanks." "Don't mention it," the stranger replied with a wave of his hand. "Just remember, things are never as bad as they seem." Jake barely had time to process the stranger's words before the man took a step back and turned, heading toward the corner of the street. Jake blinked, as if coming out of a trance. That was when he realized something strange, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The man was familiar, but it wasn't until he glanced back at the stranger's retreating figure that it hit him. It was Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves, the actor, the guy from The Matrix, the man who, at that very moment, was walking away like it was the most normal thing in the world for him to witness a stranger running over a cat on a motorcycle and then giving him life advice. Jake stood frozen for a few seconds, dumbfounded. Was this real? Was he dreaming? He looked down at the cat in his arms again, wondering if maybe, just maybe, the universe was trying to tell him something. Maybe, just maybe, he was getting a second chance. He shook his head, trying to shake off the disbelief. What the hell just happened? A few hours later, Jake found himself sitting in the waiting room of a local vet clinic, the cat safe in its carrier beside him. It was going to be okay. The vet had assured him the cat would survive with proper care, and Jake had done the right thing. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe he wasn't just a man running away from the world. Maybe, just maybe, he could face things, make things right. As he sat there, waiting for the vet to give him the full report, Jake's thoughts wandered back to the encounter with Keanu. What had the man meant by his words? Things are never as bad as they seem. Was he right? Jake didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this moment, the one where everything seemed to fall apart, was actually the beginning of something new. And that thought was enough to keep him sitting in that vet office, waiting for the world to finally make sense again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake sat quietly in the vet's waiting room, his mind still reeling from the bizarre events of the afternoon. It felt like an eternity had passed since he'd first started his ride earlier that day, but the moment the cat had twitched in his arms had somehow shifted something inside him. As if, for a split second, he wasn't just the man who'd lost everything. He was somebody who could still make a difference. Maybe. But who was Jake really? The guy on the bike? The guy who sped through life, trying to outrun his pain? Or was he more than that? The truth was, Jake didn't always know who he was anymore. It had been 2 years since the accident that had taken everything. Before that, Jake had been a different person. A husband, a friend, a man who had a future. His wife, Megan, had been his world. They'd met in college and had been inseparable ever since. Their love had been one of those stories people told about, the kind that made others believe in soulmates. They shared everything, dreams, laughter, struggles. Even when things got tough, they held on to each other. But then came that day. The day that changed everything. Megan had been driving home from work when the car lost control on the icy road. The crash was brutal. Jake had been out of town on business, and by the time he got the call, it was too late. He'd rushed back, but nothing could prepare him for seeing the woman he loved lifeless. The pain of losing her had felt like a crushing weight, one that Jake couldn't escape, no matter how fast he tried to go. In the months that followed, Jake's world had spiraled. His motorcycle became his escape. The roar of the engine drowned out the silence of his apartment, the memories of Megan, and the overwhelming sense of guilt. He'd buried himself in riding. He didn't care about anything anymore, not even himself. It was easier to lose himself in the speed and adrenaline than to face the emptiness that had taken over his heart. But now, sitting in the vet's office with the small gray tabby cat beside him, something felt different. Jake's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing a message from Charlie, his best friend and the one person who still cared enough to keep checking in on him. Charlie, yo, you good? Heard about the cat thing. You okay? Jake stared at the message for a moment before typing back. Jake, yeah, just a weird day. He hesitated before sending another text. Jake, thanks for always having my back, man. I've been, I don't know, lost, I guess. Within seconds, Charlie replied. Charlie, dude, you gotta get out of your head. You don't have to be alone in this. I'm here. Let's hang soon. Just let me know. Jake sighed, leaning back in his seat. He wasn't sure if Charlie understood the full weight of what Jake had been carrying since the accident, but he appreciated the gesture. Still, there was a distance between them, a gap that no amount of words could close. How could Charlie understand the kind of grief that Jake lived with every day? The kind of grief that twisted inside him and made him question his worth? Jake wasn't sure if he could ever feel whole again, but for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if he even wanted to. Maybe it was time to stop running. Mr. Darnell? Jake looked up, startled. A nurse was standing at the door, a clipboard in her hand. The cat's all set. She's stable and will be fine after some rest. Jake stood up quickly, relieved. Thank you. How much do I owe? She smiled kindly. Don't worry about it. It's on the house. You did the right thing by bringing her in. He nodded, stunned. The last thing he'd expected was free care for an animal he'd injured. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Really. No need. Just keep an eye on her for a few days, she said, handing him the carrier with the cat inside. And take care of yourself too, okay? Jake felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Was she implying something? Was he really that far gone that people were worried about him? Yeah, I will, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked out of the clinic, Jake couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. There was something oddly comforting about the way people were treating him today. Not just the nurse, but even the stranger, Keanu Reeves, who had appeared out of nowhere to witness his guilt and still offered a kind word. Jake didn't know if this was the start of a new chapter or just a fluke, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. He was facing something. A choice, maybe. He got on his bike, started the engine, and drove off, the wind rushing past him. But this time, he wasn't focused on the speed. He was focused on the road ahead. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Charlie. Hope that cat's okay. Let's grab a drink soon. Jake smiled for the first time in a long while and typed back. Yeah, man. Sounds good. For the first time in months, Jake felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a while. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of healing. He didn't have the answers yet. He didn't know where life was going to take him. But for now, Jake was willing to stop running. Jake rode home slowly, his mind still wrestling with the events of the day. The cat was safe now, resting at home in a quiet corner with a little bed made from an old t-shirt of his. But the cat wasn't what was eating at him. It was the way things had felt so strange, like a bizarre crossroads where everything seemed connected. Keanu Reeves, the stranger who had stopped to offer him advice, the guilt, and the strange flicker of hope that had ignited inside him after 2 years of numbness. It was all just too much. He needed to think, but thinking was hard. It always was, especially when it meant facing the hard truth. His life had been on autopilot for far too long. The motorcycle, the reckless speed, the wild nights. It was his way of trying to outrun his grief. He had avoided the people who loved him because it was easier to ignore the past, easier to not feel, easier to numb the pain with the hum of the engine beneath him. But today had cracked that shell open, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay on the other side. The familiar route to his apartment seemed endless. As he approached the building, he saw the flicker of lights in the window, the dull hum of a television still on, like it was always on, waiting for him. He could hear the distant sound of his neighbors chatting, but everything felt muffled, like he was listening to life from the other side of a thick glass wall. Jake didn't want to be alone right now, but he was. He'd been alone for so long. The loneliness had become his shadow, and there was no escaping it. He turned off the engine and parked his bike, the sound of the motor quieting as he stared at his apartment building. It was a small complex, nothing special, just 4 walls and a door that led into a room he barely recognized as home anymore. Why do I keep doing this to myself? He muttered, kicking the side of the bike stand in frustration. He had no answers, no solutions. But before he could let the frustration take over, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. Charlie. Yo, Jake answered, not bothering with a greeting. Hey man, just checking in. You good? Charlie's voice was steady, but there was an undertone of concern that Jake could hear even through the phone. I don't know, Charlie, Jake said, rubbing his forehead as if the physical act could somehow clear his mind. I'm trying to figure it out. It's just, everything feels off. Like, I'm on the edge of something, but I don't know what it is. What if I'm just messing everything up more? Charlie was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in before responding. You've been running for a long time, Jake. I get it. But the thing is, you can't outrun yourself forever. You've got to face this. You've got to stop hiding. And you don't have to do it alone. Jake's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he almost felt like he could believe that. He could almost believe that things could be different. But then reality set back in, and the weight of his own guilt came crashing down. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. He wasn't sure if he was capable of facing it. "I don't know if I can, man," Jake muttered. "I hurt people, Charlie. I let them down. I let myself down. I don't know how to come back from that." Charlie's voice softened. "Jake, listen to me. You're not the same guy you were back then. You've been through hell, but you're still here. That means something. It means you've got fight left in you." Jake stood there, staring at the empty street outside, his motorcycle beside him, his phone pressed to his ear. A strange mix of anger, sadness, and longing churned inside him, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so vulnerable. Yeah, I guess you're right," Jake said, though it didn't feel entirely true. I don't know how to start." "You start by showing up for yourself, man. That's the first step. You're already on your way. You just need to make the decision to keep going, one day at a time." Jake didn't know if he was ready for that, but the words stuck with him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending he had it all figured out. For so long, he'd kept his life at a distance. His emotions, his relationships, his own pain. He'd hidden behind the bike and the speed. But today, he couldn't run anymore. He thought about the cat, the little creature that had been run over by his own reckless actions, and it hit him. Maybe it wasn't just about running away from the guilt. Maybe it was about fixing things, making them right again, even if it was just in small ways. Maybe the cat had shown him that there was a chance for redemption, even in the smallest of acts. "I'll think about it," Jake said, a sigh escaping his lips. "I'll try." Charlie was quiet for a moment, then replied with a soft laugh. "Good. That's all I'm asking, man. You don't have to do it all at once." Jake hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he was ready for the kind of change Charlie was asking of him. But something had shifted. Something inside him had cracked open, and the idea of healing didn't seem as impossible as it once had. With one last look at his bike, Jake turned and made his way inside the apartment, the heavy silence greeting him as the door clicked shut behind him. The darkness of the apartment seemed to swallow him, but for the first time in months, Jake didn't feel entirely lost in it. There was something ahead of him now. Maybe not a clear path, but something more than just an empty road. He had a choice. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from it. The days after his conversation with Charlie felt like they were moving in slow motion. Jake couldn't pinpoint what had changed exactly, but something inside him was different. He wasn't sure if it was the phone call, the strange encounter with Keanu Reeves, or the fact that he'd actually taken responsibility for his actions with the cat. But there was a flicker of something in him now, something that resembled hope, and that scared him. Jake spent the next few days in a fog of mixed emotions. He still got on his bike, still roared down the streets, but it was different this time. His usual escape felt less effective. The wind rushing past him couldn't drown out the thoughts anymore. The thoughts about what he was running from, what he was trying to fix, and whether he even deserved to fix it. His apartment felt emptier than usual, and each time he passed by Megan's old photos or looked at the space where she used to sit on the couch, it reminded him of what he had lost. The pain still lingered in every corner of the place, but Jake was trying. He was trying to face it, and that, in itself, was progress. Small steps. He was beginning to realize that maybe the road to healing wasn't a straight path. Maybe it was just a series of turns, some sharper than others, some more difficult to navigate. It was Friday evening when he decided to go out with Charlie. He wasn't sure why. He didn't particularly feel like it, but Charlie had insisted. "Come on, man. It's time to do something normal. Just grab a drink and get out of your head for a bit." Jake had been reluctant at first, but he figured it might help. A distraction. A break from the storm inside his mind. They met at a local bar, a dive just on the edge of downtown, where the beers were cheap and the people were friendly enough to not ask too many questions. Jake sat down at the bar, Charlie beside him, his usual easy smile on his face. "So, how've you been?" Charlie asked, raising his beer. "How's the cat?" Jake took a long pull from his own drink before responding. "She's okay. The vet said she should be fine. She's, settling in." He paused. unsure how to explain his mixed emotions about the situation. It's weird, man. That whole thing. It's like it opened something up. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Charlie nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're not supposed to have all the answers, Jake. You just gotta keep going. And don't be afraid to let yourself feel what you feel. Jake wasn't sure if he agreed, but he appreciated the sentiment. Charlie had always been the kind of guy who said things like that, straightforward and without pretension. He never seemed to shy away from his own emotions, which, Jake had to admit, was something he envied. As they sat and talked, Jake found himself starting to relax. The tension in his shoulders that had been there for days began to ease. The noise of the bar, the clinking glasses, and the low hum of conversation started to blur into the background. For a moment, Jake felt like he could breathe again. But just as he was starting to let his guard down, the door to the bar opened, and a group of people walked in. They were laughing and joking loudly, clearly having a good time. Jake's eyes flicked over to the door, and that's when he saw him. Keanu Reeves. Keanu walked in casually, as if he didn't have a care in the world. He was dressed in a simple black leather jacket, a plain t-shirt, and jeans. He looked just as he had in the brief encounter on the street, like someone who didn't quite belong in the ordinary world but didn't care. He moved with that same effortless cool that Jake had seen on screen in movies like The Matrix and John Wick. Jake froze, his heart skipping a beat. What were the odds? It was the same guy, Keanu Reeves, the stranger who had given him life advice while he was in the middle of a breakdown over hitting a cat. Jake tried to play it cool, but he could feel the blood rushing to his face. Dude, you okay? Charlie asked, noticing the way Jake had gone still. Yeah, it's just him, Jake said, nodding toward the door, where Keanu had now settled into a seat at a nearby table. Charlie glanced over. Holy shit, it's really him. I know, right? Jake said, almost laughing at the absurdity of the situation. I've never seen him here before. Charlie didn't seem to know whether to be starstruck or impressed. I mean, if there's one place a guy like Keanu would go for a drink, this is it. But you've got to talk to him, man. You can't just let this go. You got to say something. Jake laughed nervously. What am I gonna say? Hey, remember me? The guy who almost ran over a cat in the middle of the street? Charlie grinned. Well, that might be a good icebreaker. Or you could just not be weird and act like a normal person for once. Jake shook his head. Yeah, right. Normal. But despite himself, he found his feet moving toward the table. Before he knew it, Jake was standing in front of Keanu's table, feeling like an absolute idiot. Keanu looked up as Jake approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Jake felt that same strange weight of recognition he'd felt before. This wasn't just some random guy. It was someone who had, in a bizarre way, changed the course of his day. Hey, Jake said awkwardly. I don't know if you remember me, but... Keanu smiled, his face softening. I remember you. Jake blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. You do? Keanu nodded. Yeah, you were the guy who hit the cat. And you didn't just drive off. You did the right thing. Most people would have kept going. But you stopped. You tried to make it right. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't expecting that. He wasn't expecting to be seen, to be recognized for something, even something small. Thanks, Jake said, his voice quieter now. I'm just trying to figure some things out. Keanu's smile widened. You're already on your way. Don't overthink it. You'll get there. Jake's chest tightened, but in a good way. It was like something inside him clicked into place. Maybe this was the moment. Maybe this was the sign he needed to keep going, to take that next step. He wasn't alone in this. There were people around him, even people he'd never expected. With a smile that felt genuine for the first time in a long while, Jake nodded and walked back to Charlie. Charlie raised his eyebrows, impressed. Did you just? I talked to him, Jake said, laughing. And he gets it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They talked, laughed, and for once, Jake didn't feel the weight of his past on his shoulders. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't seem as terrifying as it had before. As he walked out of the bar later that night, the crisp air felt different. It felt fresh. For the first time, Jake was taking a step towards something new. A step toward not just healing, but truly living again. The morning after his unexpected encounter with Keanu Reeves, Jake found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, as if waiting for a new version of himself to appear. He didn't feel different, not in any dramatic way. The mirror still reflected the same tired eyes, the same dark stubble that seemed to have become a permanent feature, the same weariness in his posture. But something had shifted in him. A tiny crack had formed, and through it, just a sliver of light had slipped in. He ran a hand through his messy hair, still trying to make sense of the night. Keanu's words had stuck with him longer than he'd expected. "You're already on your way." Those words echoed in his mind like a mantra, reminding him that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he'd thought. Maybe he could find his way out of the darkness. But there was still that gnawing feeling inside him, the guilt, the constant reminder of his past decisions, of the life he'd left behind. He could still see Megan's face, hear her laugh, and feel the warmth of her hand in his. Every single memory was a beautiful, painful reminder of the life he'd lost. Jake leaned against the sink, his gaze drifting to the small coffee maker on the counter. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take a real step forward. Every time he thought he was, he felt like he was on the verge of falling again. There were so many things he hadn't dealt with, so many things he had buried deep. The sudden buzz of his phone broke him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it off the counter, surprised to see a message from Charlie. "Charlie, hey, you good? You're kinda quiet today." Jake stared at the screen for a few moments, then typed a quick response. "Jake, yeah, just thinking." "Charlie, about what?" Jake hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't want to unload all his feelings on Charlie. Not yet. Not like this. But Charlie was his best friend. Maybe it was time to start talking. "Jake, about everything. About the past. About what I'm supposed to do next." "Charlie, sounds heavy. Want to meet up for lunch?" Jake smiled slightly at the message. Charlie always knew when to push and when to give him space. He hadn't been around for everything, but he'd seen the toll the accident had taken on Jake, and yet he never gave up on him. Maybe it was time to stop trying to carry everything by himself. "Jake, yeah, lunch sounds good." They met at a small diner on the edge of town, a place they used to frequent after late-night bar shifts when they were younger, before everything went wrong. The smell of greasy fries and sizzling burgers filled the air, mixing with the murmur of low conversations and the clatter of dishes. It was familiar, comforting in its own way. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where people came and went without judgment. Charlie was already sitting at a booth when Jake walked in, his face lighting up when he saw him. "Yo, you actually showed up," Charlie teased, pushing a menu toward him. Yeah. Don't get too excited," Jake replied with a half-smile. He slid into the booth across from Charlie, his fingers drumming absent-mindedly on the table. "So, what's going on?" Charlie asked, his voice gentle but probing. "You've been quiet the last few days. You're usually either speeding down the highway or making sarcastic comments. This is new." Jake hesitated, his eyes focusing on the cup of coffee in front of him. The caffeine felt like a lifeline right now, a small comfort as he waded through the storm of thoughts in his head. "I don't know what to do with all of it," Jake admitted, his voice softer than he expected. "I've been trying to outrun my past for so long, man. The guilt, the anger, the everything. And I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to start facing it." Charlie's expression softened. "Jake, you don't have to have it all figured out right now. You just need to take it one step at a time. You've been running away from it for so long, but you can't outrun it forever. At some point, you've got to face it. And that's the hard part. You've got to accept that you messed up, but you're not defined by that mistake. You've got a chance to start fresh, man." Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Charlie's words settle in. It was the same advice he'd been hearing for months, but something about hearing it today felt different. He wanted to believe it, but there was still a deep-rooted fear that he wasn't sure he could shake. "You don't know how hard it is," Jake muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, Megan's face, and I can't just forget that. I don't know how to move forward with that haunting me." Charlie was quiet for a moment, his eyes studying Jake as if he were trying to figure out exactly what Jake needed to hear. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have to forget her, man. You just have to learn how to live with it. She was a part of your life, a huge part, and you can still carry her memory with you. But you can't let it define your future. If you do, you'll never move forward. You'll just stay stuck in the past." Jake nodded slowly, the words settling in his chest like a heavy weight. It wasn't that he wanted to forget Megan. He would never forget her. But maybe Charlie was right. Maybe he had to learn how to live with the loss, to find a way to carry it without letting it drown him. "I don't know if I can," Jake said, his voice small. "I don't know if I can forgive myself." Charlie reached across the table and placed a hand on Jake's. "You don't have to have it all figured out, but you've got to try. Start small. Do something to make it right. You already started with the cat. You showed up for that little creature when no one else would. Maybe that's the first step." Jake stared at Charlie's hand on his, a strange warmth spreading through him. For a long time, he'd felt like he was completely alone in this struggle. But sitting here, with his best friend, he realized that maybe he wasn't. He wasn't sure what the future held or how he was going to move forward, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep carrying the weight of his mistakes like a badge of shame. Maybe it was time to start facing them, one step at a time. The sun hung low in the sky as Jake walked back to his apartment, his mind replaying the conversation with Charlie over and over again. "You've got to try. Start small. Do something to make it right." The words felt heavier than they had when Charlie first said them. It was a simple thing, really, the idea of just starting small, but it made Jake feel like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to take that first step, but unsure of what would happen next. He wasn't used to feeling so unsure. Usually, he could make decisions on the fly, live in the moment, and face the consequences later. But today was different. He wasn't just running on autopilot anymore. He was thinking, really thinking, about the things that mattered, about the things he had to change. Jake reached his apartment building and stood in front of the door for a long moment. It was the same door that had greeted him for years, the same apartment with the same creaky floorboards and peeling paint. But everything about it felt different now. The weight of his thoughts was heavy, pulling him down as he slid the key into the lock. Inside, the silence hit him immediately. The space was empty, empty of Megan's laughter, empty of the joy that had once filled the rooms. The old photos of their trips together still hung on the walls, reminders of a life he wasn't sure he could ever get back. Jake tossed his jacket onto the couch, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. His life had become a routine of isolation. The long nights riding his motorcycle, the brief escapes into the noise of the city. But none of it ever lasted. None of it ever filled the void left by Megan's absence. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to push the exhaustion away, but it stayed. There was no escaping it. The grief, the guilt, the shame. It clung to him like an old, worn-out jacket that didn't fit anymore, but he kept wearing it because it was all he knew. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his spiral of thoughts. It was Charlie again. "Charlie, you doing okay? Still thinking?" Jake stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "Jake, yeah, just thinking about what comes next." "Charlie, well, stop thinking and start doing. If you want to make it right, you have to show up. For yourself. For everyone." Jake let out a slow breath as he sat down on the couch, staring at the empty space. Charlie's words kept coming back to him, circling in his mind like a constant hum. The pressure to show up felt like an impossible task. He had spent so much time shutting people out, hiding in plain sight. How could he possibly start showing up for the people who mattered now? He glanced at the old pictures on the shelf. Megan. Her eyes were always so full of life. She had been everything to him once. His best friend, his confidant, his partner. They had been a team, always together, always in sync. And then it all fell apart. Jake knew what he had to do. It was simple. He had to show up. He had to stop being afraid of facing the truth, stop being afraid of feeling the loss that had crippled him for so long. But it wasn't easy. How did you show up for someone who was gone? The answer, Jake realized, was never going to be clear-cut. There was no roadmap for grief, No guide for what to do after you've lost the one person who meant everything. But maybe it wasn't about finding the perfect answer. Maybe it was just about taking that first step into the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, that step had to come today. Later that evening, after tossing and turning for hours, Jake finally made a decision. He was going to visit Megan's grave. It had been almost 2 years since he'd been there, since the accident. He had avoided it because it was too painful, too real. But now, he felt something stirring inside him. A kind of desperate need to reconnect, to apologize, to start the slow, painful process of healing. Jake grabbed his jacket and slipped on his boots, his mind heavy with everything he wanted to say but wasn't sure how to say. He didn't know if he could even speak when he got there. It wasn't just about words. It was about something much deeper than that. But he couldn't ignore the pull he felt to go, to face the one thing he had been running from the most. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived. The path leading through rows of gravestones, bathed in the soft light of the moon. Jake's footsteps were the only sound, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only thing breaking the stillness. When he reached her grave, Jake stopped, his chest tightening. He knelt beside the stone, his fingers tracing the engraved letters of her name. Megan Harper, beloved daughter and friend. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. The weight of his emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to speak, even if the words felt like they didn't belong to him. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have done better. I should have been there for you. I should have been a better person, a better partner. I don't know how to make it right, but I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. For you. For me." The words felt clumsy, too simple for the pain he was carrying. But it was all he had. It was all he could give. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the grief finally hitting him with full force. He didn't try to fight it this time. He let the tears come, the emotion crashing through him in waves. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the depth of the loss, to feel the regret, to feel the anger at himself. But in the midst of it, there was something else. A glimmer of hope, faint but present. Maybe it was because he had finally shown up. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he wasn't hiding from the pain. Maybe this was the first step. Jake's hands trembled as he climbed back into his truck, the weight of his visit to Megan's grave still pressing on him. It wasn't the catharsis he had hoped for. There was no dramatic moment of release, no sudden sense of closure. But it was the beginning. A small crack in the wall he had built around himself. He hadn't known what to expect, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running. He had to face the past, even if it hurt like hell. The truck rumbled to life, and Jake drove aimlessly, the moonlight illuminating the dark streets as he made his way through the empty roads of the city. It was quiet, too quiet. His thoughts were louder than the engine's hum, and they cut through him like a blade. Megan's face, her laugh, her love for him, all of it was gone, and he had been the one to let it slip through his fingers. But tonight, something was different. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely hopeless. The weight of his guilt was still there, but it didn't feel like it was suffocating him. It felt like a burden he could slowly learn to carry. Jake didn't know how long he drove, just that he needed to keep moving. The streets passed by in a blur, and eventually, he found himself back near the outskirts of town, near the old diner he and Charlie used to hang out at. He parked the truck in the lot and sat there for a moment, staring at the flickering neon sign, the same one that had been there for as long as he could remember. The door to the diner opened with a soft chime, and Jake stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. He wasn't sure if Charlie was working tonight, but he needed to talk to someone, needed to make sense of everything swirling in his mind. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the sound of a few customers talking and the clink of silverware on plates. The warmth of the place was a stark contrast to the chill in the air outside. The smell of fresh coffee filled his lungs as he walked to the counter, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Charlie, who was wiping down a table near the window. Charlie looked up and smiled when he saw Jake. Well, look who finally decided to show up." Jake forced a grin. "I needed some air. Plus, I could use a cup of your world-famous coffee." Charlie chuckled, and gestured to an empty seat. Coming right up. Jake sat down at the counter, tapping his fingers nervously on the wood. It felt good to be here, even if it didn't completely make sense. He'd spent so long pushing people away, pretending he could handle it all alone, but Charlie had always been there, even when Jake didn't deserve it. "So, how'd it go?" Charlie asked as he poured a fresh cup of coffee. "With, everything?" Jake stared into the dark liquid in his cup for a moment, then looked up at Charlie, his eyes tired but determined. "I went to her grave," he said quietly. Charlie's face softened. He didn't need to say anything. Jake could see the understanding in his eyes. "I said sorry," Jake continued, his voice thick. "I told her everything I've been carrying around. I told her I was trying. I don't know if it helps, but I had to." Charlie nodded slowly, leaning against the counter. "I think you did the right thing. It's never easy, man. But sometimes just saying it out loud is all you can do. It's the first step." Jake leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. "It didn't feel like enough. It never feels like enough." He paused, glancing around the diner, as if searching for something to hold on to. "I don't know how to keep going, Charlie. I don't know how to fix it." Charlie's smile was small but genuine. "You don't have to fix everything all at once. It's not about fixing, man. It's about learning to live with it. You're not the same guy you were before, and you can't go back. But that doesn't mean you can't move forward. Take it one day at a time. That's all anyone can do." Jake's eyes met Charlie's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Charlie was right. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe he could start doing better now. Maybe he could start showing up, not just for Megan, but for himself, too. "So, what now?" Jake asked, trying to focus on the present. "What's the next step?" Charlie tapped his finger on the counter, his eyes glinting with a playful spark. "You've got to make things right with the people who matter to you. You've got to stop running from them, and you've got to stop running from yourself." Jake felt the weight of the words sink in. He had been running for so long, from his grief, from his mistakes, from the things he couldn't control. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to face them. "I'll try," Jake said, his voice quieter now. "I'll try." Charlie grinned and slid the coffee toward him. "Good. One step at a time, man." Jake took a long sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. For the first time in a while, he didn't feel completely lost. Maybe it was because he had taken that first step. Maybe it was because he had finally started talking about the things that scared him. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running. He had to show up, and he had to keep moving forward. The next few days passed in a blur. Jake spent more time in the garage, fixing up his bike, trying to channel his restlessness into something productive. But each day, as he worked, the same question lingered in his mind. How do you make it right? He didn't have an answer yet, but he was learning that sometimes the answer wasn't about having a grand plan. Sometimes it was just about showing up and being present, even when it hurt. It wasn't easy, but Jake was beginning to realize that the road to redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. One afternoon, as he was tightening the last bolt on his bike, Charlie showed up with a grin on his face. "You ready to ride?" Charlie asked, holding up a helmet. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the bike. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a new beginning. "Yeah," Jake said, standing up. "I'm ready." As they geared up and hit the road, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of clarity. The past still lingered, but it didn't have a hold on him anymore. The road ahead was long, but it was his to travel. And for the first time in ages, he was ready to take the next step. The hum of the motorcycle engine beneath him was steady and comforting, a rhythmic sound that seemed to match the beat of Jake's heart. The wind whipped past him, carrying away the remnants of doubt and guilt that had weighed so heavily on him. Riding, for Jake, had always been a form of escape, a way to drown out the noise in his head. But today, the road felt different. It wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a journey towards something better. Charlie rode beside him, a grin plastered on his face as they sped down the highway, the endless stretch of asphalt ahead of them a metaphor for the road Jake had ahead in his life. There was something liberating about it, something that made him feel like he was finally shedding the skin of the man he used to be. The man who had been consumed by anger and regret, the man who had made choices that he could never take back. But today, Jake wasn't that man anymore. They passed the familiar sights of the city, the streets Jake had spent so many years racing down, the places that held memories of old habits and old regrets. But the more he rode, the more he realized how little those places had to do with who he was becoming. As they pulled off the highway and into a small town, Jake felt a pang of nostalgia. He hadn't been this far from the city in a while, and as they cruised through the streets, he caught glimpses of families walking together, kids riding bikes, and people chatting on porches. It was all so normal, so different from the chaotic world he'd been living in. They stopped in front of a small cafe with a faded sign, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Jake glanced at Charlie, who was already taking off his helmet. "You good?" Charlie asked, noticing the distant look in Jake's eyes. Jake gave him a small nod, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, just thinking." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not just running from something again?" Jake chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, I'm not running anymore." They made their way inside, greeted by the scent of fresh coffee and the sound of clinking mugs. The place was cozy, the walls lined with old photographs and hand-painted signs. Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him as he sat down at a corner table. It was a far cry from the loud bars and empty apartments he had grown used to. It felt real, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. As they ordered their coffee, Charlie leaned back in his chair, watching Jake carefully. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Jake took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth fill him before responding. "I'm not sure, but I think I've figured out one thing. I can't keep holding on to the past. I need to make something of myself again. I need to make up for the things I've done wrong. And I'm not talking about big, grand gestures. I'm talking about small things. Showing up, doing the work, just being there." Charlie smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. "That's the first real step, man. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to start moving forward. And you've already taken the hardest part." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't sure where the road would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so lost. The next few weeks were a blur of small changes. Jake started showing up more, not just physically, but emotionally. He began volunteering at the local shelter, helping out where he could. He spent more time with Charlie, rebuilding the bond that had frayed over the years. And he started reaching out to old friends, people he'd pushed away, people he had hurt. Slowly, but surely, he was piecing his life back together. One evening, after finishing a long shift at the shelter, Jake sat on the porch of his apartment, staring at the stars. The night was clear, the air crisp, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was drowning in his thoughts. A soft knock on his door broke the silence. Jake stood up and opened it to find Charlie standing there, holding a six-pack of beer. "I figured you might need a drink after that crazy shift," Charlie said with a grin. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think you were into beer anymore." Charlie shrugged. "Old habits die hard. Besides, I figured you could use a reminder that things don't always have to be so heavy." Jake chuckled, stepping aside to let Charlie in. "You're probably right about that." They sat on the porch, drinking their beers and watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The weight of the world didn't seem so heavy tonight. For once, Jake didn't feel like he was running from anything. The past was still there, lingering in the background, but it didn't control him anymore. He had faced it. He had started to make amends. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the road to redemption. Charlie took a sip of his beer and looked at Jake. "You know," he said, his voice serious now, "it's been a long time since I've seen you like this. You've got a long way to go, but I think you're heading in the right direction." Jake nodded, a quiet sense of gratitude filling him. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I've got to keep moving forward. I've spent too long stuck in the past. It's time to show up. For me. For the people I care about." Charlie smiled. "Good to hear, man. Good to hear." The two of them sat in silence for a while, just drinking their beers and watching the night unfold. The world outside was still, and yet Jake felt like he was finally moving. He had taken the first step, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something that had been missing for years: hope. Hope that things could get better. Hope that redemption was possible. Hope that, just maybe, he could become the man he always wanted to be. The next few weeks felt like a blur, a mix of small victories and moments of doubt. Jake continued his work at the shelter, showing up early and staying late. He wasn't just there physically, he was actually engaged. His mind was in the right place, and that had made all the difference. The kids at the shelter seemed to respond to him in ways they hadn't before. He had started to see them, really see them, and not just as faces in the crowd, but as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. But the road to redemption wasn't easy. There were still nights when Jake would lie awake, his thoughts racing as he stared at the ceiling. The ghosts of his past still haunted him. He would sometimes hear Megan's laugh in the distance or see her face in his dreams, only to wake up with that crushing sense of loss that never seemed to fade. It wasn't something that could be undone. There were moments, too, when he felt overwhelmed by the weight of his mistakes. How could he ever truly make up for the years of selfishness? How could he find peace after everything he had lost? But each day, he kept showing up. For the shelter. For Charlie. For himself. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the shelter, Jake found himself standing on the edge of the city. The view from the hill was breathtaking. Lights twinkling like stars, the hum of the city life below. The air was cool, and the quiet was almost deafening. It felt like the perfect place for reflection, the kind of place where you could finally hear yourself think. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Charlie. "Charlie, you good? Need a ride somewhere? Or just some company?" Jake smiled faintly. Charlie was always checking in, always there when he needed him most. The guy had never given up on him, even when Jake had pushed him away. "Jake, I'm all right. Just thinking. But yeah, maybe I could use some company. I'll be at the hill near the city overlook." The reply was immediate. "Charlie, on my way." Jake chuckled softly to himself as he put the phone back in his pocket and looked out over the city. It had taken him a long time to get here, to a place where he could admit that he needed help, that he couldn't do it alone. But there was something freeing about that, something that made the weight of his past feel just a little bit lighter. It wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about making progress, about taking the next step, no matter how small. Jake was learning that, and every day he grew a little bit closer to the person he wanted to be. Minutes later, Charlie's bike pulled up beside him, the rumble of the engine cutting through the silence. Charlie parked and took off his helmet before walking over to where Jake stood. "You're a little more pensive than usual," Charlie remarked, his voice light, though there was concern in his eyes. "What's going on?" Jake shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the city below. "I don't know, man. Just thinking about everything. About the things I've done, the things I can't change. I feel like I'm making progress, but then I stop and wonder if it's enough. If I'll ever be enough." Charlie stood beside him, quiet for a moment, before replying. "You're doing better than you think. None of us are perfect, Jake. Hell, I've made my own mistakes. But you're showing up. That's what matters." Jake turned to look at his friend, appreciating the weight of his words. Charlie had never been one to sugarcoat things, but he also had a way of putting things into perspective. "Yeah," Jake muttered, "but I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling like I'm failing. Like I can never fix the past." "Maybe you can't fix the past," Charlie said, his tone steady, "but you can keep moving forward. You can make better choices from here on out. That's all anyone can really do." Jake nodded slowly, taking in Charlie's words. The weight of his guilt was still there, still lingered at the edges of his mind. But Charlie was right. He couldn't change what had already happened. He could only choose how to live moving forward. "Yeah," Jake said again, his voice quieter this time. "One day at a time." Charlie grinned and clapped him on the back. "That's the spirit." The two of them stood there in silence for a few moments, watching the city below. The lights shimmered, and for a brief moment, Jake could almost believe that everything would be okay. that this long road ahead wouldn't be so bad. The next few days felt different. There was something in the air, a sense of anticipation. Jake was no longer just working at the shelter or putting in the hours. He was actively seeking change. He was starting to reach out to people he'd once abandoned. His parents, old friends, even the people at the shelter who he had always kept a distance from. One afternoon, after a particularly hard morning at the shelter, Jake found himself walking down the street, his mind clouded with frustration. There were moments when the pressure of everything, the past, the guilt, the constant need to prove he could change, felt like it was all going to crash down on him. He had just passed a small bookstore when he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Jake?" He turned to see Kate standing by the entrance to the bookstore, a soft smile on her face. Kate. She had been one of the few people he had truly pushed away. Their friendship had started off strong, but over the years, he had shut her out, focusing on his own pain rather than the people who cared about him. And Kate had always been there, a constant reminder of what he had lost. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but Kate's eyes softened, and she stepped toward him. "I heard about the work you've been doing at the shelter," she said, her voice gentle. "I think it's incredible. I'm proud of you." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. The last time they had spoken, it hadn't ended well. But standing there in front of her, hearing those words, it felt like the first time in ages that he could truly breathe. "Thanks, Kate," he said quietly, his voice thick. "It means a lot to hear you say that." She smiled. "I know it's not easy, but you're doing it. You're showing up. That's what counts." Jake nodded, feeling something shift within him. Maybe it wasn't about proving himself to anyone else. Maybe it was about proving to himself that he could make things right, that he could be the man he wanted to be. They stood there for a moment, just talking about the things they had missed. It felt like old times, but different, more genuine. And for the first time, Jake didn't feel the weight of the past bearing down on him so heavily. He still had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. It was one of those rare days when everything felt in sync: the weather, his mood, the rhythm of his daily life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city as Jake rode his bike down the streets. It was a quiet afternoon, and the sound of the engine beneath him was the only thing that accompanied him as he made his way through familiar streets, streets that once felt like a prison. Now, they felt like a path, one that was still uncertain, but one that he was ready to travel. Jake had been working harder than ever at the shelter. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was actively engaged. There were days when he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, when he wanted to scream or quit, but he didn't. And every day that he kept going felt like a small victory. It wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. The more time he spent giving to others, the more he realized that his own healing was rooted in doing good in the world. As he pulled into the parking lot of the shelter, he spotted Charlie's bike parked nearby. That was no surprise. Charlie had been a constant presence, checking in on him, offering support in a way that felt less like a friend and more like a brother. Jake didn't know how he had gotten so lucky with a friend like him, but he wasn't about to take it for granted. Stepping off his bike, Jake walked toward the shelter's entrance, the door creaking open as he pushed it. The smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices greeted him as he entered. There were a few kids gathered around a table, some doing their homework, others chatting quietly. A sense of calm lingered in the air, and Jake felt a strange kind of peace settle over him. This was his place now. This was where he was making a difference. "Hey, Jake," one of the kids called out from across the room. Jake turned to see Leo, one of the younger boys, grinning up at him. Leo had been with him for a few months now, a quiet kid with a troubled past. But Jake had noticed a shift in him lately, a little more confidence, a little more hope. Jake smiled and waved, walking over to him. "Hey, Leo, how's the homework coming along?" "It's all right," Leo replied, his eyes bright with a hint of mischief. "I was just wondering if you'd be up for a challenge after I finish. We could race on the bikes. You know, see who's the fastest." Jake chuckled. "You're on. But just know, I'm not going easy on you." Leo grinned. "I wouldn't want you to." As Jake turned to walk toward the back office, he caught Charlie's eye from across the room. Charlie gave him a knowing smile and a small wave. Jake returned it with a nod before heading in to start his shift. But just as he was about to open the door to his office, a woman stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Her face was familiar, her eyes kind and warm, but her expression was one Jake had seen many times before. Worried, uncertain. It was Kate. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a conversation they'd needed to have for a long time. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jake paused, the door still in his hand. He glanced over her shoulder, where Charlie had gone back to talking to the other kids, as if he could sense the tension in the air. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Of course," he replied. Kate led him outside to the small courtyard behind the shelter. The noise of the kids inside faded, replaced by the sounds of birds chirping and the distant hum of traffic. It felt like a world apart from the chaos of Jake's past, a quiet space for something important to happen. They both sat down on the worn bench under a tree, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jake had so many things he wanted to say to Kate. Apologies, explanations, even the truth of why he had shut her out all those years ago. But he wasn't sure where to start. Kate seemed to sense this, her voice gentle when she finally broke the silence. "Jake, I know things haven't been easy. I know we've had our moments, and I know I'm partly to blame for not pushing harder to get through to you. But I want you to know something. I'm proud of what you're doing here. You're changing, and I see that. I see you." Jake looked down at his hands, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. He had pushed so many people away, including Kate. He hadn't wanted anyone to see him as weak. But now, sitting here with her, he realized how much he had missed her presence in his life. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "I should have never shut you out. You were always there for me, even when I didn't deserve it, and I was too selfish to see it." Kate's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his. "Jake, you don't need to apologize. I know you were going through a lot, and we all have our moments. But you're here now, and that's what matters. You're showing up for the people who need you. You're showing up for yourself." Jake's chest tightened, and he looked up to meet her eyes. He had so many regrets, so many moments that haunted him, but hearing her say that felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about moving forward. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Kate gave him a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. I just want you to know that I believe in you, Jake. I always have." For a long moment, the two of them sat in comfortable silence. It wasn't the end of their story. It wasn't some grand reunion or a fairy tale moment. But it was a start, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The rest of the day passed in a blur, filled with the usual mix of kids coming and going, conversations, and small tasks that kept Jake on his toes. But there was a lightness to his step now, a sense that something important had shifted. He wasn't just living in the shadow of his past anymore. He was building something new, one step at a time. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the shelter, Jake found himself outside once again, this time leaning against the side of the building, looking out at the street. The world around him seemed so big, so full of possibilities. And yet, for the first time in ages, he felt like he could take on whatever came next. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Jake pulled it out to see a message from Charlie. "Charlie, how's it going? Got time for a race later?" Jake couldn't help but smile. He typed back quickly. "Jake, you're on. I'm ready to lose again." "Charlie, that's the spirit." Jake tucked his phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right track. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. He wasn't running anymore. He was living. And that was enough. Jake wasn't sure when things had started to change, but looking back now, he realized it had all been building to this moment. His life felt different. Not in the dramatic way that movies promised, no sudden epiphany or grand gesture. Instead, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the shift of the seasons. A slow realization that he was becoming someone new. It was a Friday evening when the tipping point finally arrived. Jake had just finished up a late shift at the shelter, the worn-out floor beneath his boots echoing the exhaustion that ran through him. He had helped the kids with their homework, led a group activity, and even stayed later than usual to finish paperwork that was always getting pushed aside. By the time he made it outside, the stars had begun to twinkle in the sky, the cool night air brushing against his face. He hadn't been riding much recently, too caught up in the day-to-day work, the routine of helping others, the small but significant changes he was making in his life. But tonight felt different. As he walked toward his bike, he noticed Charlie leaning against a nearby lamppost, arms folded across his chest, waiting. There was a subtle energy about Charlie tonight, like he was on the edge of something. Maybe it was just the anticipation of their usual bike race. And maybe it was something more. "You ready to lose again?" Jake said, his voice carrying a playful edge. Charlie grinned, his eyes sparkling. "You sure you want to race? I don't want to embarrass you in front of the whole city." Jake raised an eyebrow, adjusting his helmet. "You know the rules. No holding back." Charlie chuckled, but didn't make a move to mount his bike. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at Jake seriously, almost like he had something on his mind. "Hey, Jake," he started, his voice quieter than usual. "You've been killing it at the shelter. But don't forget, you're allowed to take breaks too. You're allowed to enjoy life. Don't let yourself get so caught up in fixing things that you forget to live." Jake blinked, surprised by the weight of Charlie's words. He had always known Charlie had a way of seeing through to the core of things, but tonight felt different. It was like Charlie was speaking to him on a deeper level. "I'm living," Jake replied, a little defensively, as he threw his leg over his bike. "Just not in the way I used to." Charlie shook his head, his smile still there, but with a hint of concern. "That's not what I mean. You're doing great, but you've been running yourself ragged lately. You don't have to carry all the weight on your own." Jake paused, gripping the handlebars of his bike a little tighter. He wasn't used to people telling him to slow down, to give himself permission to breathe. He was used to pushing harder, doing more. "I know," Jake said finally, his voice quieter now. "It's just that I don't know how to stop. If I stop, then what?" Charlie gave him a knowing look, his gaze softening. "You keep moving, Jake, but you have to learn how to balance it with living. Otherwise, it'll wear you out." Jake didn't have a reply for that. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of. If it was the fear of letting go of control, or if it was something deeper, something that told him if he ever stopped, even for a moment, he might drown in everything he was trying to outrun. But tonight, something inside him shifted. He knew Charlie was right. Maybe he had been so focused on making up for the mistakes he had made that he'd forgotten how to live in the present. "I'll think about it," Jake said, his tone lighter, the weight of the conversation settling like a small, gentle burden on his shoulders. Charlie grinned and pushed off from the lamppost, mounting his bike. "Good. But for now, let's race." And just like that, the moment passed. The air shifted back to that familiar energy, and the two of them were off, speeding down the street, pushing each other harder than they had in a long time. For a few minutes, all Jake could think about was the rush of the wind, the sound of his bike's engine, and the feeling of freedom that came with it. But as the race came to a close, Charlie, of course, winning, as always, Jake slowed his bike down and pulled over to the side of the road. He could feel the buzz of the evening starting to fade, the quiet settling in again. Charlie came to a stop beside him, grinning like a kid who had just won a major victory. "Told you," he said with a wink. Jake laughed, shaking his head. "You're impossible." But then, as the laughter faded, there was a silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was different. Jake found himself staring at the ground, his mind swirling with the thoughts Charlie had dropped on him earlier. "Maybe it's time to let go a little," Jake said, his voice softer now. "I've been so focused on doing everything right that I forgot to live. And maybe that's why everything feels so heavy." Charlie's expression softened as he nodded. "It's okay to be a work in progress. You don't have to have everything figured out." Jake took a deep breath, looking out at the street before him. "Yeah, I know. But for the first time, I think I'm starting to realize that I don't have to be perfect. I just have to show up. That's enough." Charlie's smile widened. "Exactly." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The pressure had been lifted, just a little, and as the night air grew colder, He realized that this moment, this small shift, was one of the most important ones he had experienced in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges. But for the first time, Jake wasn't afraid to face it head-on. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep moving forward. The next day, Jake woke up with a different mindset. His shift at the shelter felt lighter, the pressure of perfection no longer weighing on his shoulders. He helped out with the kids, shared laughs with the staff, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was constantly racing against a clock. And when the day was over, he didn't rush home to deal with the overwhelming mess of his past. Instead, he took a walk. A simple act, but one that felt new to him. He wasn't running. He wasn't trying to outrun anything. He was just being. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Jake realized that the moment wasn't just a small victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. He wasn't sure where it would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was truly living. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake was slowly coming to terms with something that had been gnawing at him for a while now. He had spent so long building up walls around himself, fighting his way through life, convincing himself that all he needed was sheer willpower to keep moving forward. But the truth was starting to sink in. Walls don't keep out the bad stuff. They keep out the good stuff, too. The truth wasn't pretty, but it was there, staring him in the face. The past few weeks had been transformative, and Jake could feel the shift in himself. He had allowed himself to open up, to let people in. Charlie, Kate, the kids at the shelter. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just existing. He was living, truly living. But there was still something buried deep inside him, something that he wasn't sure how to face. It was a Wednesday when it hit him. The shelter had been busier than usual, with more kids coming in for after-school activities. Jake was pulling double duty, helping with homework and running the evening program. As the hours dragged on, he felt the weight of everything pressed down on him. His energy was starting to wane, but he pushed through. As he sat down with a group of kids working on a creative project, he felt it. The creeping sensation of doubt. The voice in his head that said he wasn't enough, that he was just pretending to have it all together. The voice that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. "You all right, Jake?" Charlie's voice broke through his thoughts. He was standing just a few feet away, looking at him with concern. Jake snapped out of his daze and quickly plastered a smile on his face. "Yeah, just tired, you know?" Charlie didn't buy it. He took a few steps closer, his brow furrowed. "Tired? Or something else?" Jake let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. He was good at brushing things off, but Charlie wasn't going to let him get away with it this time. "I don't know, man," Jake admitted, his voice low. "I thought I was doing better, but it's like the more I try to help, the more I realize how messed up I really am." Charlie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You don't have to have all the answers, Jake. No one does. It's okay to be a work in progress. I don't have it all figured out either." Jake laughed bitterly. "Yeah, but you seem so together. You know what you're doing. Me? I just feel like I'm playing catch-up all the time." Charlie shook his head. "That's the thing, Jake. We all have our cracks. We all have our moments when we feel like we're falling apart. But you don't have to hide it. Not from me, not from anyone. You don't have to pretend to be perfect." Jake looked away, trying to hide the storm that was brewing inside him. He wasn't used to this, being open, being vulnerable. But Charlie was right. Maybe it was time to stop pretending that he had everything under control. I'm not sure I can keep doing this," Jake murmured, more to himself than to Charlie. "The kids, the shelter, the whole thing. I feel like I'm failing them." Charlie stepped closer and put a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring gesture. "Jake, you're not failing anyone. You're here. You're showing up. That's more than most people do. You don't have to have all the answers to make a difference." Jake let out a shaky breath, his heart heavy with unspoken words. It wasn't that he didn't want to help. It wasn't that he didn't care about the kids. He did, more than anything. But he felt like he was running on empty, and it was starting to show. He looked up at Charlie, his expression vulnerable for the first time in ages. What if I'm not enough? What if I burn out and let everyone down? Charlie's gaze softened, and he squeezed Jake's shoulder gently. You don't have to do this alone, Jake. You've got me. You've got Kate. And you've got these kids who look up to you. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep showing up. And if you need a break, that's okay too. You're allowed to rest. Jake nodded slowly, taking in Charlie's words. He wasn't used to asking for help. He wasn't used to leaning on anyone, but for the first time, he realized he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders alone. Later that night, after the kids had gone home, Jake found himself alone in the shelter's office, staring at the paperwork he had been avoiding for days. His mind was still racing, his heart still heavy. But as he sat there in the quiet, something inside him shifted again. He had spent so long thinking that he had to have everything figured out, that he had to be the one to fix everything. But maybe it was okay to admit that he didn't have all the answers. Maybe it was okay to ask for help. Maybe it was okay to let the cracks show. The next morning, Jake made a decision. He reached out to Kate and Charlie, asking if they could meet for coffee. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a step toward acknowledging that he wasn't alone in this. He wasn't the only one carrying the burden. When they met later that afternoon, Jake was surprised by how much lighter he felt, just by talking about what was on his mind. They didn't offer solutions or tell him how to fix things. They just listened. They reminded him that it was okay to feel overwhelmed sometimes, and that he didn't have to shoulder everything on his own. I've been trying so hard to do everything right, Jake admitted, his voice full of raw honesty. But maybe I've been focusing on the wrong things. I've been trying to fix everything instead of just being present. Kate smiled gently. Jake, it's not about being perfect. It's about being there. And you're doing that. You're here for these kids, you're here for Charlie, and you're here for yourself. That's enough. Jake nodded, feeling a small sense of peace settle over him. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to have it all figured out. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to show up, one day at a time. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, Jake realized that he wasn't as alone as he had once felt. The cracks in his armor weren't something to hide. They were part of what made him real. And maybe that was the key to truly healing. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, but there was a difference in Jake's demeanor. He was still giving everything he had to the shelter, to the kids, to his friends, but he was doing it with a little less pressure on his shoulders. He had started asking for help when he needed it, and it made all the difference. It wasn't an instant fix, and it wouldn't be. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was finally on the right path. The cracks in his armor didn't define him. They were just part of his story, and that story was still being written. Jake was still trying to find balance. The thing about old habits is that they don't go down without a fight. No matter how hard he tried to leave behind the drive that had always pushed him to go faster, do more, and never rest, it was always there, lurking in the background, ready to take control again. That afternoon, Jake found himself sitting at his kitchen table, the leftover coffee from his morning rush now cold and forgotten. He'd been staring at his phone for the last 15 minutes, scrolling through messages and emails. Stuff for the shelter, of course. Things that needed to be done, people who needed his help, decisions that had to be made. It was always something, and for a moment, Jake felt that familiar tug, the one that told him he couldn't slow down. He shook his head, letting out a deep sigh. Maybe it was the coffee, or maybe it was just the reality of his overpacked schedule, but Jake could feel the familiar weight of burnout creeping in again. He thought he had been doing better. He'd opened up, asked for help, and even given himself permission to take breaks. But now, sitting there with the avalanche of work piling up in front of him, he could feel his old instincts kicking back in. The doorbell rang, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. Jake glanced at the clock. It was a bit earlier than expected for Kate to swing by for their usual check-in, but he wasn't about to ignore it. He stood and made his way to the front door, opening it to find Kate standing there with a smile and a bag of groceries. "Hey," Kate greeted him, holding up the bag. "I thought I'd drop by and help you with dinner tonight. You've been running yourself ragged lately, and I figured a home-cooked meal might do you some good." Jake smiled gratefully, stepping aside so she could come in. "You know me too well." Guilty, she said with a wink. I've seen the way you've been working lately. It's like you think you're going to save the world by yourself. Jake couldn't help but chuckle, though it was tinged with a hint of defensiveness. I'm not trying to save the world. Just trying to make a difference, you know? Kate raised an eyebrow as she set the bag down on the counter. Jake, you're already making a difference. But you don't have to carry the whole world on your shoulders. You've got people around you who want to help. Don't forget that. Jake felt the familiar knot tighten in his chest. The truth was, he hadn't forgotten. He just wasn't used to relying on others. He was so accustomed to being the one who stepped in, who fixed things, who pushed through when everyone else gave up. And he knew that if he slowed down, even just for a second, everything might fall apart. I know, but it's hard, Kate. I feel like if I don't do it, it won't get done. And if I don't keep going, things will unravel. Kate turned to him, her eyes soft but firm. Jake, that's the pressure you're putting on yourself. Nobody else expects you to be perfect, and you don't have to do it all alone. But you're going to burn out if you don't learn how to let go sometimes. Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Kate cut him off, her voice gentle but insistent. Look, I get it. I do. I know what it's like to feel like you're the only one who can handle things. But you have to trust the people around you. And you have to trust yourself enough to take a break. Jake rubbed his face with one hand, frustrated but unable to ignore the truth in Kate's words. She was right, of course. But it wasn't that simple. Letting go felt like giving up, and giving up was something Jake had sworn never to do. So, what do you want me to do, huh? Just stop? Let everything fall apart? Kate shook her head. No, not at all. Just take a moment. A small moment. You don't have to do it all right now. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders. You just need to take a step back, breathe, and remember that you're human. Jake exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as he sat down at the table. The weight of everything, the shelter, the kids, his own personal struggles, felt overwhelming. It was hard to even imagine letting go. But maybe Kate was right. Maybe the key to moving forward wasn't pushing harder but allowing himself to breathe, to give himself space. I don't know how to stop, Kate, Jake admitted quietly. I've been running for so long, I don't even know what it means to rest. Kate sat across from him, her expression softening. Then maybe it's time to start learning. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're human. And that's okay. Jake looked at her for a long moment, taking in her words. Slowly, a small sense of clarity started to creep in. He didn't have to have everything figured out. He didn't have to be the hero. He just had to show up, and sometimes, showing up meant allowing himself to be vulnerable. Kate reached over and put a hand on his. You've done more than most people ever will, but you don't have to do it all at once. Jake nodded slowly, feeling a small shift inside him. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start taking care of himself the same way he cared for others. Later that evening, as they sat down to a simple dinner, homemade pasta and a salad with far too many toppings to count, Jake felt a quiet peace settle over him. He didn't have to rush. He didn't have to do it all. He could be present. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't a magic fix. But it was a step. A small, quiet step toward finding balance in a life that had always been lived in overdrive. The next day, Jake made a conscious effort to slow down. It wasn't easy. His instincts were still telling him to move faster, work harder, make sure everything was perfect. But he was learning, one small moment at a time, that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was living, showing up, being present, and allowing himself to experience the highs and lows without fear. As he arrived at the shelter, he took a deep breath before heading inside. Today, he wasn't going to rush through it all. He was going to be present. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Jake woke up to the sound of rain tapping softly against his window. The soft, rhythmic patter should have been soothing, but instead, it felt like the weight of the world pressing in on him. He turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling as the realization of what was coming sank in. The cracks that had started to show, the moments of vulnerability he had allowed, were now pushing him towards something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had tried. He really had. But lately, no matter how hard he worked to keep everything together, at the shelter, with his friends, with Kate, it felt like the pressure was finally starting to get to him. He couldn't even pinpoint exactly what it was. Maybe it was the constant sense of responsibility, the ever-growing pile of obligations, or maybe it was just the slow build of stress that had accumulated over the past few months. Whatever it was, Jake knew that something was about to break. He rolled out of bed, still feeling the weight of exhaustion, and trudged into the bathroom. His reflection stared back at him in the mirror, tired eyes, messy hair, and a faint shadow of doubt that had begun to settle on his face. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. Where had the guy gone who used to be so full of fire, so driven to change the world, no matter what? That guy was still there, somewhere. But today, he didn't feel like him. The shower was a blur of steam and cold water, a brief attempt to wash away the fog that had taken over his mind. When Jake stepped out, the rain was still falling. He dressed quickly, not bothering with the usual care, and grabbed his keys. As he left the apartment, the weight of the day ahead seemed to multiply with each step. He had an early meeting with the shelter board, some paperwork that needed to be signed, and then a volunteer shift at the local food bank. His schedule was packed, but he didn't feel the usual rush of adrenaline. He felt hollow. When Jake arrived at the shelter, Charlie was already there, waiting in his usual spot by the front door. He was holding a clipboard, looking over a list of volunteer shifts, but when he saw Jake, he immediately put it down. "Hey, man," Charlie said, his voice light, but Jake could see the concern in his eyes. "You okay? You look like you're running on empty." Jake forced a smile, trying to shake off the weight that had been hanging over him all morning. "Yeah, I'm good. Just tired. It's been a long week." Charlie didn't buy it. "You sure? You've been saying that for weeks now. You're not fooling anyone, man. You look like you're about to crash." Jake's chest tightened, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't want to admit it, but Charlie was right. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't control. The exhaustion, the pressure, the constant responsibility. It was all starting to catch up with him. "I'm fine," Jake muttered, stepping past Charlie and into the shelter. "Let's just get to work." The morning passed in a blur. Jake moved from one task to the next, trying to keep his mind focused on the work at hand. But the distractions were relentless. Every time he paused, the weight of everything started to creep back in. The questions, the doubts, the guilt. Was he doing enough? Was he really making a difference? Or was he just spinning his wheels? By the time lunch rolled around, Jake had barely eaten, barely spoken to anyone. He was trapped in his own head, caught in the cycle of self-doubt that had become all too familiar. He sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was a million miles away. "Jake, you're avoiding lunch again?" Kate's voice cut through his thoughts, and he looked up to find her standing in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at him with a mix of concern and frustration. "You've got to take care of yourself, or this place is going to fall apart without you." Jake let out a hollow laugh. "That's the thing, Kate. I don't know if I can keep this up anymore. I'm trying, but I'm not sure I'm enough. It's all slipping through my fingers." Kate stepped into the room, pulling up a chair across from him. "Jake, you don't have to be enough all the time. That's the point. You're only human, and I can tell you're running on fumes. You've been pushing yourself for months, and it's taking a toll." Jake's eyes burned with the weight of his emotions. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be the guy who could handle it all, who could carry the load without breaking. But the reality was, he couldn't do it alone. And he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. "I don't know how to stop Kate," Jake admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know how to ask for help. I don't know how to let go." Kate's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand gently over his. "You don't have to do it alone, Jake. You've got people who care about you, people who want to help, and it's okay to lean on them. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real." Jake felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years. Vulnerability. He had spent so long pushing it down, pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. But in that moment, with Kate's understanding gaze fixed on him, something inside him cracked wide open. It wasn't about having it all together. It was about admitting that he couldn't do it all on his own. For the first time in months, Jake felt the tears well up in his eyes. He wasn't sure why he was crying. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was just the overwhelming realization that he didn't have to carry everything by himself. But he couldn't stop the floodgates from opening. "I've been so scared, Kate," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "Scared that if I stop, I'll lose everything. Scared that I'm not enough to make a difference. I've been running away from it all, but it's catching up with me." Kate didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her hands still on his, offering him the silence and space to process. Then, when the tears finally slowed, she spoke softly, her words laced with quiet strength. "You're not alone, Jake, and you're more than enough. You always have been." Jake took a deep breath, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. It wasn't the answer he had been looking for. It wasn't a magic fix, a quick solution to all his problems. But it was enough. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to feel human. Later that afternoon, as Jake walked out of the shelter, he felt a shift within himself. The weight of the world wasn't gone. It never would be. But now, for the first time, he was willing to share that weight. He didn't have to carry it all on his own. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The next few days passed in a haze of self-reflection and small, quiet steps toward change. Jake wasn't fully healed. He wasn't expecting to be, but something inside him had shifted. He had let his guard down in ways he hadn't even known he was capable of, and though it had been uncomfortable, it was also liberating. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to. Jake still woke up early every morning, and he still went to work at the shelter, but now there was a gentler pace to his life. He no longer felt the constant pull to do more, to be more, to fix everything. There were moments of quiet, long enough to notice the little things. The way the sunlight streamed through the windows at dawn, the sounds of laughter from the kids he'd worked with, the warmth of his morning coffee. It was enough. Maybe more than enough. As the week went on, Kate kept reminding him to take breaks, small ones, but ones that mattered. She'd show up at the shelter with coffee, just to sit and talk. Or maybe she'd drag him away from his endless to-do list to go for a walk in the park. Little by little, Jake began to realize that these moments of stillness weren't a luxury. They were essential. The more he allowed himself to pause, the more he felt like his old self returning, even if just in small pieces. One afternoon, after a particularly tough meeting with the shelter board, Jake found himself at the local diner. He'd ordered a burger and fries, his mind still reeling from the heated discussion that had just wrapped up. The board had been tough, pushing for more tangible results, more numbers, more proof that the shelter was truly making a difference. Jake had fought back, trying to make them understand that the heart of the shelter wasn't something you could measure in statistics. It was in the people, the lives they were touching, the small victories. But that was hard to explain to people who only saw things in terms of profit margins and spreadsheets. He had left the meeting feeling drained and a little defeated. It wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of pushback, but it stung just the same. As Jake sat in the booth, staring at his plate of food, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Charlie standing there, smiling. "Mind if I join you?" Charlie asked, already slipping into the seat across from Jake. Jake shrugged, trying to muster a smile. "Sure, I could use the company." Charlie didn't waste any time digging into his own food, but he watched Jake for a moment, his expression softening. "You've been working your ass off, man. You okay?" Jake took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He hadn't realized how much he was carrying until he'd let himself feel it. "I don't know. The meeting was tough. They're pushing for more results, more numbers, and I don't know how to make them understand that the work we're doing isn't something you can measure like that." Charlie nodded, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, I get it. That's the hardest part, right? The impact isn't always something you can show on paper, but you know the difference you're making, and so do the people you're helping. That's what matters." Jake met his gaze, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Charlie was right. Maybe he couldn't convince everyone with statistics or graphs, but he didn't need to. The people whose lives had been touched by the shelter, the families who had found hope and safety. Those were the stories that mattered. Those were the numbers he needed to focus on. "You're right," Jake said quietly. Sometimes it feels like I'm not doing enough. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never going to be enough." Charlie leaned back in the booth, his expression thoughtful. "Man, you're doing more than most people will ever do in their lifetime. It's just hard to see it when you're in the thick of it. But trust me, every single day you're making a difference. Maybe not in the way they want to see it, but you're making it." Jake let out a shaky breath, the weight on his chest feeling just a little lighter. He wasn't going to let the board's pressure make him lose sight of the bigger picture. The shelter, the kids, the community. It was all worth it. He didn't have to prove himself to anyone except those who mattered. "Thanks, man," Jake said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I needed that." Charlie grinned, taking a bite of his burger. "Anytime. And hey, if you ever need a reminder that you're not alone, I'm just a phone call away. You don't have to carry all this on your own." Jake nodded, feeling a small but real shift inside him. The weight he'd been carrying didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. As they finished their meal, Jake found himself thinking about the future. He wasn't sure what it would look like, or how things would work out with the shelter, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to control every aspect of it. He had people who cared, a team who believed in the mission, and a community that needed him. That was enough. The world might not change overnight. He might not fix everything right away. But Jake had learned something invaluable. True strength didn't come from doing everything on your own. It came from knowing when to ask for help, when to lean on others, and when to step back and take care of yourself. Jake didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like he was headed in the right direction. The sun was setting as Jake stood outside the shelter, staring at the sky as the last of the golden light faded into deep shades of purple and blue. He had just wrapped up another long day, but there was a change in him now. The relentless pressure he had been under for so long still lingered, but he wasn't carrying it the same way anymore. He had learned to let go, at least a little bit. He could still feel the temptation to fall back into old habits, to drown himself in work and avoid the hard conversations with himself. But now, every time he felt that pull, he remembered the last few days, the conversations with Kate, the moments with Charlie, and even the soft reassurance from people at the shelter who had seen him struggle and still believed in him. He wasn't alone anymore. "Jake, there you are." A familiar voice broke his thoughts, and Jake turned to see Ryan, one of the volunteers at the shelter, jogging over with a grin on his face. Ryan had been a steady presence in the shelter for months now, a guy with a big heart who did everything from leading mentorship programs for the kids to cleaning out the storage room on weekends. "Hey, Ryan," Jake greeted him, smiling back. "What's up?" Ryan slowed to a walk as he caught his breath, then held up a piece of paper. "I've been looking over the numbers from the last fundraising event, and," he paused, eyes wide. "Man, you're not going to believe this." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" Ryan grinned. "We did it. We surpassed our fundraising goal by 30%. The numbers are through the roof. And guess what? A couple of local businesses are already talking about partnering with us for future events." Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. The fundraising had been one of the toughest challenges they'd faced recently, with so many setbacks and challenges. But somehow, the team had managed to pull it off, and the community had rallied behind them in ways they hadn't expected. "That's incredible," Jake said, his voice filled with awe. "How did that happen? I didn't think we were going to make it." Ryan shrugged, his grin never fading. "Honestly, it was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of people coming together. We had more volunteers show up than we thought, and everyone just kept pushing. I think we all saw how important this shelter is to the community, you know? We're not just a place for people to sleep, we're a lifeline. And the town's finally seeing it." Jake felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The pressure of the fundraising effort had been overwhelming, and there had been moments when he had questioned whether they could pull it off. But now, standing there, hearing Ryan's words, Jake realized just how far they had come. Not just in terms of money raised, but in terms of the community's belief in their mission. "This is huge, man," Jake said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe it." Ryan's eyes softened. You made it happen, Jake. You've been leading this thing for months now. You're the one who kept everyone focused. Without you, none of this would have happened. Jake felt a flush of warmth spread through him, but it wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the realization that this success wasn't his alone. This was a team effort, a collective strength that he hadn't fully understood until now. Thanks, Ryan, Jake said, his voice thick with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you and the rest of the team. Ryan clapped him on the back, giving him a playful shove. Don't go getting all sentimental on me, man. We've still got work to do. But this is definitely a big win. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. There was still a long road ahead, but for once, it didn't feel like an endless climb. He had learned how to share the load, how to lean on others when he needed it, and it was paying off. Not just in the numbers, but in the way the community was rallying behind them. As the night went on, Jake found himself surrounded by staff and volunteers, all celebrating the success of the event. There was laughter, music, and a sense of camaraderie that he had never fully appreciated before. For so long, he had been so focused on the pressure, on the weight of responsibility, that he hadn't taken the time to truly celebrate the small victories. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, they were celebrating more than just a successful fundraiser. They were celebrating the resilience and strength of everyone who had come together to make the shelter what it was. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Jake found himself standing outside, staring at the stars. He didn't feel the usual weight of expectation hanging over him. Instead, he felt lighter, freer. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to do everything on his own. He didn't have to carry the burden of the world alone. You look like a man who just caught a break. Kate's voice came from behind him, and Jake turned to find her leaning against the doorframe of the shelter. Jake chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. I guess I did. We actually did it. We surpassed our goal. Kate smiled, pushing herself off the doorframe and walking over to him. That's amazing, Jake. I'm so proud of you. He shook his head, still feeling a little dazed by the turn of events. It wasn't just me, Kate. It was everyone. The team, the community. It's not just about the numbers. It's about what we're building here. And tonight, for the first time, I actually feel like we're getting somewhere. Kate nodded, her eyes soft. You are. You've come so far. And you've learned something really important along the way. You don't have to do it all alone. Jake felt a surge of gratitude for Kate, who had been there through all of it. Through the burnout, the doubts, the pressure. She had been the one to remind him to slow down, to take care of himself. And now, as he stood there, looking at the stars and feeling a rare sense of peace, he realized just how much he had changed. I'm still learning, but I think I'm getting there, Jake said quietly, his gaze fixed on the sky. And I'm starting to believe that I don't have to be perfect. I just have to keep going. Kate smiled, a proud and understanding look in her eyes. And that's more than enough. As they stood together, watching the night settle in, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more struggles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next, because he wasn't facing it alone. The days that followed the fundraising success felt like a breath of fresh air. The shelter was operating at full capacity, and the newfound support from the community was keeping the momentum going. Jake's schedule was still packed, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of balance, something he hadn't even realized he was craving. However, as the weeks passed, Jake's feelings of calm began to be tested. The board that had initially applauded the fundraising success now started pushing for more. They wanted tangible metrics. They wanted to see the impact, the change they had been promised. And as the pressure mounted, Jake felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping back into his chest. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the storm started to gather. He was in the office, surrounded by paperwork and volunteer schedules, when Charlie walked in with a stack of reports under his arm. His face was tight, his brow furrowed in that way Jake had come to recognize as a sign of trouble. Jake, Charlie began, setting the reports down on the desk. We need to talk. Jake looked up, his heart sinking at Charlie's tone. What's going on? Charlie's lips pressed together in a thin line. We've got a problem. The board wants to see specific, measurable results by the end of the month. They're not happy with just the fundraising. They want to see proof that we're actually making a difference in the lives of the people we're serving. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. He had anticipated this, of course. Nothing in his work was ever good enough without a detailed report to back it up, but hearing it out loud still stung. He had worked so hard to make the shelter a safe haven, a place of hope, but the board saw it as a numbers game. How are we supposed to show them that? Jake asked, his voice rising slightly. This isn't about statistics, Charlie. It's about lives. It's about the people we're helping. You can't measure that in a spreadsheet. Charlie shook his head. I know, man. I know. But that's what they want. They're already talking about cutting funding if we can't deliver something concrete. They're not hearing us when we say it's about more than just the numbers. Jake leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. The weight of it all was threatening to crush him again. The shelter had always been about providing support, care, and resources for the people who needed it most. But the more the board demanded metrics and hard evidence, the further it felt from the mission he had always believed in. What do we do? Jake asked quietly, almost to himself. Charlie gave him a sympathetic look. We fight for it, man. We keep pushing back. We show them what we can, even if it's not in their format. But we need your leadership. You've got the vision. We just need to figure out how to get them to see it. Jake nodded, feeling a surge of resolve stir inside him. He wasn't going to let the heart of the shelter be reduced to a series of spreadsheets. They had made a difference, and they would continue to do so, no matter what the board wanted to see. I'm not giving up, Jake said, standing up, but we need to show them something. We need to prove to them that we're not just another organization. They need to understand what this place really means. That evening, Jake sat down with his team, Ryan, Charlie, Kate, and a few of the shelter staff members, and began brainstorming ways to convey the shelter's impact. They needed a way to translate the intangible, the human stories, into something the board could understand. It wasn't going to be easy, but Jake wasn't backing down. They spent hours together that night, digging into the history of the shelter, reaching out to the people who had been helped, and compiling real stories of transformation. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, real, and undeniable. They would show the board the faces of the people who had found hope, the families who had rebuilt their lives, and the kids who had found a safe place to grow. By the time Jake left the shelter that night, the storm inside him had calmed. There was still uncertainty, still a nagging feeling that they might not win this battle, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose, true purpose. He wasn't just going to fight for the shelter. He was going to fight for the people who needed it most. As he stepped into his apartment, Jake immediately collapsed onto the couch, too tired to think but unable to quiet his mind. He was still running on adrenaline, feeling the weight of what was coming. But as he closed his eyes for a moment of rest, a thought struck him. This fight wasn't just about the shelter. It was about everything he had been learning in the past few months. It was about standing up for what mattered, even when it was hard, even when the odds were stacked against him. In the quiet of his apartment, Jake thought about the people who had come through the shelter's doors, the ones who had faced unimaginable odds and had somehow found their way back to themselves. These were the stories that mattered. These were the results that mattered. The board could look at spreadsheets all they wanted, but Jake knew the truth. The difference they were making was something you couldn't measure. It was in the smiles of children who finally felt safe. It was in the mothers who had found jobs, the fathers who had regained custody of their kids, the homeless who now had a roof over their heads. The shelter wasn't a charity, it was a lifeline. Jake didn't have all the answers, and he knew the battle wasn't over. But he felt something inside him shift once again. This time, he wasn't just fighting for the shelter. He was fighting for every person who had walked through those doors, for every person whose life had been touched by what they were building. And he would do whatever it took to make sure that mission stayed intact. The next morning, he was up before dawn, ready to face the day. He would stand firm in his conviction, not just for himself, but for every life the shelter had touched. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more hurdles to clear, but Jake wasn't backing down. He had something bigger than a spreadsheet on his side. He had people, he had a community, and he had hope. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The shelter's team had worked tirelessly to put together their presentation for the board, hoping to demonstrate the profound, unquantifiable impact the shelter had on the community. Jake had personally written the narratives, the stories of the people they'd helped, but also how the shelter had been a catalyst for change in ways the board might not understand at first glance. But despite all the preparation, doubts still gnawed at him. They could tell stories until they were blue in the face, but would the board truly listen? Would they see the value in the human experience over numbers? The fear of rejection, of failure, loomed large. Kate had been a quiet but strong presence throughout it all. She'd helped organize the presentation materials, added her own stories of the kids she'd mentored, and even suggested that they reach out to some of the shelter's regulars, people who'd been through the toughest times, people who had turned their lives around thanks to the support of the shelter. Jake appreciated her steady calmness, but even with her by his side, there was a tightness in his chest. His phone buzzed at noon on the day before the presentation, and he glanced down to see an email from the board chair. His heart sank. The email contained a list of last-minute demands, more data on volunteer hours, a breakdown of financial expenditures, a projection of the shelter's impact over the next 5 years. It felt like they were asking for more than Jake could give, like they were asking him to sacrifice the heart of the mission for the sake of meeting arbitrary expectations. "This is ridiculous," Jake muttered to himself as he read through the email again. Kate, who had been sitting across from him, looked up from her computer. "What is it?" she asked softly. "The board's asking for more data. They want projections, volunteer metrics, stuff we don't even have ready right now," Jake said, frustration thick in his voice. "It's like they think if we give them enough numbers, they'll magically see the value in what we're doing." Kate sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I know, Jake, but maybe we can give them what they want, but also show them what they need to see. What you and I know is the real story. We can't just give them numbers. We need to remind them what this is really about." Jake's hand tightened around his phone, and for a moment, he felt like the world was closing in on him. There was so much at stake, and he didn't know if he was prepared for what came next. That evening, they worked late into the night, revising the presentation and trying to blend the data with the stories. They needed to show the board the concrete results, but they also needed to remind them that the shelter's value wasn't just in numbers, it was in the people they helped. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jake rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. He was tired, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to go into that meeting tomorrow ready to stand his ground. He wasn't going to let the board reduce their work to a set of charts. The next morning, as Jake drove to the shelter, his nerves were on edge. His thoughts kept racing. What if it wasn't enough? What if they turned him down and decided to pull their support? He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to push the fear aside, but it lingered. When he arrived at the shelter, he found Kate and Charlie already in the conference room, setting up for the presentation. The rest of the team filed in shortly after, and there was a quiet energy in the room, a mixture of nerves and determination. Finally, the board members arrived. They filed into the room with their stern faces, their briefcases, and their eyes that looked more like skeptics than supporters. Jake swallowed hard, his heart pounding. The meeting began with pleasantries, but Jake could tell that the tension was thick. The board chair, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, looked at the team and then at the presentation materials. "Let's get straight to it," Linda said, flipping through her binder and looking at Jake. "We've received your reports, but as I mentioned in my email, we need more clarity. We need to see how your work is translating into tangible results." Jake took a deep breath. It was time. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, ready to speak. "Thank you all for your time. I know you've all seen the numbers we've submitted, but what I'd like to show you today is something that doesn't show up on a spreadsheet." He clicked a button on his laptop, and a slideshow of photographs appeared on the projector screen. Images of kids playing soccer in the shelter yard, of a mother and father smiling as they sat together in a therapy session, of a woman shaking hands with a potential employer as she stood in the shelter's job training room. "These are the faces of the people we serve," Jake continued, his voice steady but filled with passion. "These are the stories that numbers can't capture. The real impact we're making isn't in statistics. It's in the lives we're changing every single day. These photos, these are the results. This is what our work means." He clicked to the next slide, showing a graph that illustrated the shelter's volunteer hours over the past year. He then moved to the next slide, showing a graph that compared the percentage of families who had gained employment or stable housing after using the shelter's services. "But I want you to see something here," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "This data is important. We can track it. We can measure it. But what we can't measure is the hope in the eyes of these families, the confidence they regain, the future they now believe is possible. We're not just providing shelter. We're providing opportunity. We're providing change." The room was quiet, the board members looking at the slides and listening to Jake's words. Linda, the board chair, looked up at him, her expression unreadable. There was a long pause. Finally, she spoke. "You're right. This isn't something we can measure with just numbers. It's something more. But the numbers still matter." Jake nodded, his heart still racing. "Of course they do. And we're committed to providing more data, but we also need you to understand that it's not just about the bottom line. It's about the people we're helping, and that's something you can't put on a spreadsheet." Linda was quiet for a moment, and Jake's nerves were on edge, waiting for her response. Finally, she stood up and nodded. "You've made your case, Jake, and we'll give you the support you need. But we want to see a more detailed report going forward, and we'll need those numbers in line with what we're asking for. But we're willing to back you, because we believe in what you're doing here." Jake exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As the board filed out of the room, Jake's legs felt weak from the tension. But as he looked around at the faces of his team, Charlie, Kate, Ryan, and the others, he realized something. He hadn't just fought for the shelter's survival. He'd fought for its soul. And today, that battle had been won. The days after the board meeting passed with a mix of relief and renewed determination. Jake and the team had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The board had agreed to continue their support, but there were strings attached. They needed more data, more detailed reports, and clearer projections. Jake knew that those demands would only increase over time, but for now, they had a chance to keep the shelter running. However, the success of the presentation had brought more than just relief. It had reawakened something in Jake. The fire that had been somewhat smothered by the constant grind, the pressure of managing the shelter's day-to-day operations, now burned brighter. He realized that in his fight to keep the shelter alive, he had almost lost sight of what it had always been about, the people. And it was time to reconnect with that core. Kate could see it, too. Over the next week, Jake became more energized, more engaged. He began to focus less on the spreadsheets and more on the stories. He spent more time with the residents, hearing about their journeys, understanding their struggles and victories. He reconnected with the mission, the real heart of the shelter, and with every conversation, he felt himself growing stronger. But Jake knew there were still cracks to mend, especially within the team. The tension between them and the board had been palpable, and while they had achieved victory, it hadn't come without some scars. Charlie had pulled back a little in the days following the meeting. He wasn't as quick to jump into discussions, and there were moments when Jake noticed him staring off into space, lost in thought. "Hey, Charlie, you all right?" Jake asked one afternoon, finding Charlie sitting alone in the staff room, his elbows propped up on the table. Charlie looked up, blinking, as if he hadn't heard Jake approach. "Yeah, man. Just thinking." Jake pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. "About what?" Charlie sighed and rubbed his face. "About all of it. The board, the numbers, the pressure. We won, sure, but I feel like we're walking on eggshells now. I don't know if we can keep this up." Jake leaned back, taking in his friend's words. He had known that the battle for the shelter's future would be far from over, but hearing Charlie voice his doubts hit harder than Jake had anticipated. Charlie had always been a rock, a steady, reliable presence. If even he was struggling, that meant things weren't as solid as they seemed. "You're right," Jake said slowly. "The pressure's not gone, and I'm not going to pretend it's all sunshine now. But we can't let it break us. We've come too far, and we're doing real work here. You know that, right?" Charlie gave him a half-smile. "I know, but sometimes it feels like we're just stuck in a cycle. We hit one target, and the next thing we know, there's another one. It's exhausting, Jake." Jake nodded, understanding completely. "It is. But we've got something the board doesn't have. We've got each other. We've got the team. And we've got the people we're serving. We're not in this alone. Charlie sighed again, but this time, it was softer. I know, man. I just don't want to lose sight of why we're doing this. The numbers, they're important, but they're not everything. Jake smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for Charlie's honesty. We won't lose sight of that. I promise. But we need to stick together. All of us. We're not just a team. We're a family. For a few moments, there was silence between them. But Jake could see the tension easing in Charlie's shoulders, the furrowed lines in his brow softening. It wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but it was a start. We've got this, Jake, Charlie said quietly. We'll figure it out. Jake nodded. Yeah, we will. As the weeks went on, Jake worked hard to rebuild trust within the team, reminding them of their shared mission and the power of the work they were doing. He made sure to take time to listen to their concerns, to check in with each person, not just as colleagues but as friends. He knew the road ahead was going to be tough, and the board's demands would only increase. But they had a bond that couldn't be broken by numbers alone. They had each other, and that was the foundation that would hold them steady. One morning, Kate found Jake in the common area, sitting at a table with a group of residents. He was listening intently to a young woman named Jessica, who had recently moved into the shelter with her son. Jessica was talking about her struggle to find stable housing and a steady job, but there was something in her voice that had changed. It wasn't the despair Jake had heard when she first arrived. It was a glimmer of hope, of determination. Kate watched as Jake nodded, encouraging Jessica to keep going. He wasn't just listening. He was invested in her story, in her journey. Kate smiled to herself, feeling a warmth in her chest. She knew what Jake was doing. He was reconnecting with the heart of the shelter, the real reason they were all there. As Jake looked up and caught Kate's eye, he gave her a small nod. She knew what that gesture meant. He was back. They were back. Later that day, Jake gathered the team together for a quick meeting. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks, the tension having lifted somewhat. Charlie, still a bit wary, was there, but his eyes were a little brighter. Everyone seemed to be in a better place. We've got more work ahead, Jake began, his voice steady but full of conviction. But we're in this together. I know the pressure's not gone, and I know the board is going to keep pushing, but we've got something they can't measure. We've got the heart of this place, and that's something worth fighting for. There was a collective nod from the group, and even Charlie seemed to relax a little. Kate smiled at Jake, and he returned the gesture, feeling the weight of everything they had been through, but also the hope of what lay ahead. They weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over, but they had come so far. And as long as they stuck together, there was nothing they couldn't face. The weeks that followed the board meeting felt like a slow-motion race. Jake knew they were still under the microscope. The board's demands for more data, more transparency, more measurable results kept coming. But Jake was determined to make sure that the heart of the shelter stayed intact. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about the people, the stories, the lives that had been changed by their work. Despite the mounting pressure, there was something different in the air. The team seemed more unified than ever. They were tighter, more resilient. Charlie was no longer withdrawn, and Kate was full of new ideas for ways to engage the community. Even Ryan, the quiet and often brooding volunteer coordinator, seemed to be pulling together the volunteers with renewed energy. The work was still tough, but they had a renewed sense of purpose. One crisp morning, as Jake was reviewing some paperwork in his office, the door creaked open, and Charlie walked in. His face was unreadable, which made Jake immediately tense. "Hey, what's up?" Jake asked, setting down his pen. Charlie stood there for a moment, looking uncertain. "You might want to come out here for a minute," he said quietly. Jake's stomach twisted in a way that only happened when something was about to go wrong. He followed Charlie down the hallway and into the main lobby of the shelter. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, murmuring quietly. Jake's eyes scanned the room, and his pulse quickened when he saw who was standing at the center of the group. It was Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. Jake's brain went into overdrive as he tried to make sense of the situation. Why was Keanu Reeves here? And how was it that the shelter staff hadn't mentioned this before? His eyes flicked to Charlie, who looked as confused as Jake felt. Uh, Charlie? Jake asked, his voice hoarse. What the hell is going on? Charlie shrugged, just as confused. I don't know. He showed up a few minutes ago. Said he wanted to speak to someone in charge. Jake's mind raced. There had to be a reason Keanu Reeves was here. Was this some kind of prank? Was he doing research for a movie role? Was he here for some sort of publicity stunt? Keanu noticed Jake approaching, and his warm, almost serene smile immediately set him at ease. Hey there, man, he said with a slight wave. I'm Keanu. Jake blinked. He'd always seen Keanu on the big screen, but meeting him in person, especially like this, was something he never could have prepared for. He shook Keanu's hand, trying to hide the shock from his face. Jake, nice to meet you. I didn't expect. Keanu's smile widened, as if he understood exactly what Jake was thinking. Yeah, I get it. It's a little surprising, huh? Jake finally regained his composure. Surprising doesn't begin to cover it, he said with a chuckle, though his mind was still racing. So, what brings you here? Jake asked, trying to steer the conversation into calmer waters. Keanu looked around at the shelter's bustling lobby, his expression thoughtful. I've heard about this place, what you're doing here. And I gotta say, I think it's incredible. Jake blinked again. You've heard about us? Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, I've been following your work for a while. I've been supporting shelters and programs like this for years, and when I saw what you're doing, I knew I had to come by. I wanted to meet you in person, and maybe, if you're open to it, I could help out. The words help out hit Jake like a freight train. For a moment, he stood there, speechless. Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, wanted to help them? Help out. Jake repeated, trying to keep his cool. Like, how exactly? Keanu's expression remained warm and earnest. Well, for one, I can help spread the word. I've got a bit of a platform, and if I can use it to bring more attention to what you're doing here, I will. Maybe we can organize some events, or even a fundraiser. Whatever you need. Jake's mind whirled. The idea of a fundraiser, with Keanu Reeves' name attached to it, was nothing short of a game changer. It was the kind of publicity that could elevate the shelter to a whole new level. But he had to keep his wits about him. That's amazing, Jake said, struggling to contain his excitement. We'd love to have your help. But, honestly, I wasn't expecting a celebrity to walk through our door, let alone offer to get involved. Why us? What made you choose this place? Keanu looked around the shelter, his gaze lingering on the children playing in the corner, the mothers chatting, the volunteers who were bustling around, making sure everything ran smoothly. It's simple, really. What you're doing here, Jake, it's real. You're not just checking boxes or going through the motions. You're actually changing lives. That's something I want to be a part of. There was a quiet sincerity in his voice that sent a ripple of emotion through Jake. For all the doubts Jake had about the future of the shelter, for all the moments he wondered if they could keep up with the growing expectations, hearing those words from someone like Keanu Reeves gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Keanu glanced around the room, as if seeing the place with fresh eyes. You've got something special here. I think it's time people saw it. Jake's heart was pounding, but he couldn't suppress a smile. Yeah, I think you're right. Over the next hour, Jake and Keanu sat down with the team and started brainstorming ideas for how they could work together. Keanu was remarkably grounded and hands-on, offering to help with outreach, lend his time for events, and even potentially use his contacts to set up some meetings with other influential people who could help support the shelter's mission. He was serious about getting involved, and the team was energized by the prospect of working with him. But even as they talked about plans and possibilities, Jake couldn't shake the disbelief. Keanu Reeves, actor, philanthropist, and cultural icon, was here, in their shelter, offering to help in ways Jake had never imagined possible. As they wrapped up their meeting, Keanu stood to leave, his smile just as genuine as when he walked in. Thanks for your time, Jake. Let's do something great together. Jake extended his hand, shaking Keanu's with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Thank you, Keanu. You have no idea how much this means to us. Keanu gave him a nod and a final smile before walking out the door, leaving the shelter staff buzzing with excitement. The future suddenly felt brighter. Jake stood there for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Sometimes, life threw unexpected curveballs, and sometimes they could change everything. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind. Keanu Reeves' involvement had shifted everything for the shelter, from the way the staff viewed their work to the possibilities they had never dared imagine. Jake had always believed in the mission of the shelter, but now, with Keanu lending his name and his time, the sky felt like the limit. Keanu wasn't just offering vague promises. He was actively working alongside the team, setting up meetings with potential donors, and using his platform to draw attention to the shelter. It was an odd but invigorating experience for Jake. For so long, he had been fighting for every dollar, every ounce of attention to keep the shelter afloat, and now here he was, working with one of the most famous men in the world, trying to take the shelter's efforts to a whole new level. But it wasn't just about the publicity. It was about something deeper. Keanu had a way of making people feel seen, heard. His interest wasn't driven by the desire to score a public relations win. He genuinely wanted to help. One evening, after a meeting with a potential corporate sponsor, Keanu stuck around to chat with Jake. "You know," Keanu began, leaning against the wall, "when I first heard about this place, I didn't realize the scale of what you're doing. It's inspiring. I mean, people talk a lot about homelessness, but what you're doing is showing the world a different way. It's not just about giving people a place to stay. You're helping them rebuild their lives." Jake wasn't used to hearing praise like that. He wasn't used to having someone like Keanu really understand the heart of the work. "We're just trying to make a difference," Jake said, trying to play it cool. Keanu smiled. "Well, you're doing a hell of a job. I think we can take this further. What you have here is a model. More people need to see it." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He'd known the shelter was doing good work, but hearing someone with Keanu's stature say it out loud made everything feel more tangible. Like, maybe they really could change the world in their own way. A few days later, the shelter held its first official fundraiser since Keanu's involvement. The venue was modest, a local event hall, but the energy was electric. People from all walks of life had come together, united by one cause: supporting the shelter and its mission. Keanu, of course, was there, along with several of his friends and colleagues who had been moved by the shelter's work. The turnout was more than Jake could have ever hoped for. Local business owners, influencers, and even politicians had shown up, all eager to contribute. As the event went on, Jake stood in the back of the room, watching the energy pulse through the crowd. People were excited. They were talking about the shelter, about the impact it had on the community. They were donating money, time, and resources. It was the kind of event Jake had only dreamed of organizing. But amid all the applause and good vibes, there was a small voice in his head telling him to stay grounded. Even though things were going well now, there was still so much work to do. The funds raised that night would help, but they weren't a permanent solution. Jake knew that. He knew it was a constant battle, one that could slip away just as easily as it had been won. Keanu noticed Jake's somber expression from across the room and made his way over to him. "You good?" Keanu asked, his voice calm, as always. Jake nodded, but it was a thin smile. "Just processing everything, I guess. This is a big night for us." "It is," Keanu agreed, his eyes flickering with warmth. "But it's only the beginning. You've got the momentum now. You just have to keep pushing forward." Jake looked at Keanu, feeling a sense of clarity that had eluded him for so long. "I know, but I can't help but worry. I feel like, what if we're not enough? What if this whole thing just fades away, and we end up back where we started?" Keanu shook his head. "You're not alone in this, Jake. You've got a whole team. You've got the community. And you've got something far more valuable than just money. You've got purpose. You know why you're doing this. That's what will keep you going, even when things get tough." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. There was something about Keanu's words that always seemed to find the right place inside him. It wasn't just motivation. It was a reminder that the work they were doing was worth it, beyond the stress, beyond the setbacks, beyond the uncertainty. "You're right," Jake said, his voice steadier now. "We've got something real here, and I'm not giving up on it." Keanu smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "I didn't think you would." The night continued, and Jake found himself re-energized. The donations poured in, the conversations grew deeper, and the support felt stronger than ever. As the event began to wind down, Jake took a moment to step outside, needing a breath of fresh air after all the excitement. He stood by the front door of the hall, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, standing in the cool night air, surrounded by the buzz of success and the sense of possibility, he knew one thing for certain. They were on the right path. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Jake felt ready. Whatever came next, he knew they would face it together. With the team, with the community, and now with the support of someone like Keanu Reeves, they had the chance to make a real difference. And that was worth fighting for. The morning after the fundraiser, Jake woke up to a feeling he hadn't had in a long time: hope. The event had exceeded all expectations. The donations, the partnerships, the conversations, it was all coming together in a way that felt sustainable. For the first time in months, he felt like the shelter had a real shot at surviving, growing, and becoming something truly impactful. But he knew the hard work wasn't over. It would never be over. Jake met with the team that morning in the same conference room where they'd started planning for the future. There was a buzz in the air, a tangible excitement, and it was almost like they had turned a corner. Keanu had stayed involved, and the word about the shelter's mission was spreading faster than Jake had ever anticipated. "All right, team," Jake said, standing in front of the whiteboard. "We've raised some serious funds, but that's just the beginning. We need a strategy to take this to the next level." Kate, always the optimist, jumped in with a grin. "We need more events like last night, more visibility, more community involvement." Ryan, who had been quieter lately, added, "and more support from local businesses. We've got their attention, now we need to keep it." Jake nodded, feeling energized by their ideas. He'd always believed in the power of community, but now, seeing it take shape before his eyes, he realized how crucial it truly was. The team was on fire. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about building relationships, creating long-term partnerships, and creating a space where people could thrive. "And we need to make sure we're not just helping people survive," Jake said, his voice steady. "We're helping them rebuild. We've got to focus on skills training, job placement, mental health support. We're not just a shelter. We're a launchpad for new beginnings." Charlie, who had been quiet up until now, cleared his throat. "Jake, I know we're all in this, but we've got to think bigger. What if we open more locations? Not just here, but in other parts of the city. Maybe even other cities?" Jake felt a surge of excitement. This was the kind of thinking that could really take them to the next level. The possibilities were endless. But he knew it was going to take time, planning, and most importantly, the same unbreakable commitment they'd built together. "We can do it," Jake said, meeting Charlie's eyes. "We need to keep expanding our reach, get more people involved. This isn't just about us. It's about the community, about giving people more chances, more opportunity." There was a shared energy in the room. It wasn't just the hope from the fundraiser or the attention from Keanu. It was something deeper. It was the bond they had built together, the vision that had begun to take shape, and the lives that had already been impacted by their efforts. As the meeting wrapped up, Jake looked around the table at the faces of the people who had helped him get this far. Kate, with her passion for outreach. Charlie, with his big ideas and determination. Ryan, with his quiet leadership and commitment. And the rest of the team, who had worked tirelessly to make sure everything ran smoothly, day in and day out. They had all come together for a common purpose, and together, they were going to make it happen. Later that afternoon, Jake sat down at his desk, staring out the window as he reflected on everything that had led to this moment. When he first took over the shelter, it felt like an insurmountable task, like trying to swim upstream against a current that would never let up. But now, with the support of the team, the community, and yes, even Keanu, Jake could see a future that was brighter than he ever thought possible. He thought about Jessica, the young woman who had come into the shelter a few months ago, uncertain and afraid. She was now working part-time at a local cafe and taking online classes to finish her high school diploma. Her story wasn't unique. There were so many like her, and that's what kept him going. The people who came through those doors, looking for a second chance. It was all worth it. As Jake leaned back in his chair, the phone rang. He picked it up, unsure of what to expect. Jake? It was Keanu's voice on the other end. I've been thinking. I've got some people I think could really help take things to the next level. I'm planning a few meetings with some influential donors, and I'd like you to be there. I think it's time to take this nationwide. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but it seemed like the momentum they'd built was only picking up speed. I'm in, Jake said without hesitation. Let's do it. Great, Keanu said, his tone warm. I'll make sure you're set up for everything. And remember, we're in this together. We've got a real chance to make an impact here. Jake hung up the phone, his mind racing with possibilities. The shelter could expand beyond just one location. Maybe they could create a network of shelters, each offering the same support, the same sense of community that had helped so many already. He felt a surge of gratitude for the journey they had already been through, for the people who had shown up when things were at their lowest. But most of all, he was grateful for the people who were still with him. The work was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, hurdles to overcome, and days when they would doubt whether it was all worth it. But as Jake looked around at the team, at the community that had rallied around them, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The shelter was no longer just a place for people to find temporary shelter. It was a beacon of hope, a launchpad for new beginnings. And Jake was more determined than ever to keep it that way. The journey had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?